June 6, 1944. Just try and picture it. Dawn breaking over the English Channel, gray sky, gray sea, and then this almost unbelievable sight. 7,000 ships carrying 130,000 men, and then another 20,000 dropping from the sky. I mean, the documentary we're looking at, June 6th, 1944, The Light of Dawn, it says it perfectly. Mai vista una simile armata nella storia dell'umanità.
Never seen such an army in human history.
Exactly. Just, wow. The sheer scale is where we have to start today.
It really was an absolutely unprecedented concentration of, well, everything. Resources, manpower, sheer willpower, all focused on this one massive, incredibly risky objective.
Right. And that's what we're diving into. D-Day, June 6th, 1944, and what happened right after. And our main guide here is that documentary, June 6th, 1944, The Light of Dawn.
Yeah, and our goal really is to get beyond just the basic story of Allied victory. We want to dig into the key decisions, the huge challenges that both sides were facing, and the human cost. It was immense.
Definitely. We want to uncover some of maybe the surprising bits, the complexities that the documentary really brings out.
And it does a good job, I think, of showing different perspectives. You've got the big names, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Churchill on the Allied side, but also Rommel from the German view.
And crucially, the ordinary soldiers, their experiences, and the people who were actually there filming it all.
Those cameramen, yeah. Their stories are something else.
Okay, so how did this enormous operation even come about? Where did it start?
Well, you really have to go back to the Tehran Conference. That was December 43. Stalin had been pushing and pushing hard for the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe.
To take some pressure off the Eastern Front, right? Which was just unbelievably brutal.
Exactly. He desperately needed relief. Now, the Allies had been fighting in North Africa and then Italy.
Yeah, but that Italian campaign kind of bogged down, didn't it? A documentary mentions them getting stopped near Naples. Tough terrain.
Very tough. It became clear that pushing all the way into Germany through Italy was going to be incredibly slow and costly. A different plan was needed.
So Roosevelt started thinking differently.
Yeah, his perspective shifted. He wanted to finish off the Third Reich, and quickly, in the West. Plus, he was hoping, maybe optimistically, for some post-war cooperation with the Soviets. A major landing in France seemed the best way.
And Churchill. He was initially hesitant about a cross-channel attack, wasn't he?
He was. He had memories of Gallipoli and other costly amphibious operations. But eventually, he saw the necessity. He agreed.
Okay, meanwhile, on the other side, Hitler knew an invasion was coming eventually, right? Since Pearl Harbor, basically.
Oh, absolutely. He'd been anticipating it. That's why he ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, this massive defensive line, over 4,000 miles long, from Norway all the way down to Spain.
Another huge undertaking.
Huge. But here's the crucial thing. The German High Command was pretty convinced the landing would happen at Calais.
The pads of Calais, yeah.
Yeah.
The shortest crossing point. Makes logical sense.
It does. And the Allies did everything they could to encourage that belief. But this miscalculation about the real landing zone, that was vital.
And building that wall. The documentary mentions the human cost there, too. Forced labor.
Yeah, grim stuff. French workers, refugees, Jewish people, prisoners of war, all forced to build these defenses.
Right. So jump forward to January 44. Eisenhower gets the top job. Supreme Allied Commander.
Yep, Roosevelt appoints him. He arrives in London mid-January to get Operation Overlord planning underway. The documentary shows him. You get a real sense of his quiet confidence, his belief in the democratic forces he was leading.
And he brings in his team, Montgomery for the ground forces.
That's right. Ike's deputy for land forces had to be British, politically. So Monty gets the job. He had the big reputation from North Africa, beating Rommel there.
And that famous photo op with the map all covered up. Classic Monty.
Yeah. Bit of showmanship. But behind the scenes, the decision had already been made. Normandy, not Calais.
Why Normandy?
Well, it was further away, harder to reach from Britain, but the thinking was the defenses would be weaker there, precisely because the Germans expected the attack at Calais. The initial plan was a fairly narrow landing zone.
But Montgomery wanted to go bigger.
He argued for widening the front. His idea was to grab Cochin quickly on the eastern side to get elbow room, avoid being penned in on the beaches, and crucially, push west to capture Cherbourg.
The deep water port for supplies.
Exactly. You couldn't sustain that massive army for long without a major port. Cherbourg was vital.
So secrecy was everything. They had to keep the Germans completely guessing about Normandy.
Absolutely paramount. And the Germans were still guessing, even into early 44, which is where all the Allied deception efforts came in. Operation Fortitude, it was called.
Right. The fake army group under Patton
Yeah.
pointed at Calais.
That was part of it.
Yeah.
Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks and planes positioned opposite Calais, double agents feeding misinformation. A really elaborate campaign to reinforce the idea that Calais was the target.
While the real buildup was happening much more quietly down south.
Precisely. All hidden away in the south of England.
Okay, let's flip back to the German side. Hitler brings in Rommel to beef up the defenses. The Desert Fox.
Yep. Back in 42, actually, he'd been tasked with inspecting and improving the Atlantic Wall. When he arrived in France in early 44, he wasn't impressed. He thought the beach defenses were way too patchy.
So what did he want to do?
His priority was creating a continuous line of defense and just packing the coast with mines, millions of them. But he clashed with his boss, Field Marshal von Rundstedt.
How so?
Rommel wanted the Panzer divisions, the tanks, positioned right near the coast, ready to hit the invaders the moment they landed, throw them back into the sea.
Makes sense. Counterattack quickly.
That was Rommel's view. But von Rundstedt preferred keeping the panzers further inland as a mobile reserve, to wait, see where the main landing was, and then strike. More flexible, maybe, but slower.
Who won that argument?
Von Rundstedt, mostly. Hitler kind of split the difference, didn't fully back Rommel, so the panzers weren't ideally positioned to stop the landings immediately. That internal disagreement, that tension, it mattered.
So Rommel's trying to build obstacles, lay mines.
Yeah.
But Eisenhower wasn't too worried about needing a port right away.
Well, this is where things get really clever. The Allies had a secret weapon up their sleeve. Something truly innovative.
Go on.
The Mulberry Harbors. Artificial harbors. Top secret project. British and American engineers had been designing and building these enormous floating structures for months.
Floating harbors. How did that even work?
Okay, so you have these huge concrete boxes called Phoenix caissons, massive things. The plan was to tow them across the channel.
Tow concrete boxes across the channel.
And then sink them in lines offshore to create breakwaters, calm water inside. Then they had floating roadways, pontoons basically, that would connect the breakwaters to the shore.
So ships could unload directly onto the beaches, regardless of tides.
Exactly. Troops, trucks, tanks, supplies, straight onto land. It bypassed the need to capture a heavily defended port in the first few days. An incredible piece of engineering. Really shows how logistics can be just as important as fighting.
Wow. Okay, so back in Britain, the preparations are just immense. The documentary shows some weird stuff like synchronized swimming.
Huh. Yeah, that looked a bit odd, didn't it? But it highlights the scale of the training. They were testing everything, all the specialized gear they'd developed.
Like what?
Well, tanks designed to clear mines, tanks that could lay down matting on soft sand so other vehicles wouldn't get stuck. Those Churchill crocodile flamethrower tanks, terrifying things.
They even practiced driving jeeps on bumpy roads.
She did. Trying to simulate the Normandy terrain. They knew about the bocage country, those hedgerows. They tried to prepare for absolutely everything, even used a really hazardous site in Cornwall for training.
And the number of troops, Americans pouring into Britain.
Huge numbers, over 800,000 GIs by February 44, and more arriving all the time. Young guys mostly, probably never been abroad before.
Must have been a culture shock for both sides.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
The documentary touches on that. The different accents, the stereotypes, the GIs having better rations generally.
More chocolate, right?
More everything, pretty much. And, the social impact. Lots of young men suddenly arriving. Fraternization, relationships. The documentary even mentions rises in divorces and illegitimate births. A massive social upheaval.
But underneath all that, a shared purpose. Eisenhower speaking at Sandhurst. Churchill watching paratrooper drills.
A sense of unity, yeah. And the documentary rightly highlights the guys filming it all. The Army Film Unit cameramen. Sergeants Grant, O'Neill, Clegg. Volunteers, many of them.
Their job was just to record it, knowing how dangerous it would be.
Exactly. Documenting history as it happened, we see them getting paid in French francs, realizing Normandy's the target, getting their final orders. Incredibly brave. They were right there in the thick of it.
So you've got hundreds of thousands of men, tons of vehicles, supplies, all moving to the ports on the South Coast.
Yeah.
19 embarkation points. The scale is just mind-boggling.
It is. And then comes Eisenhower's biggest decision, maybe, when to go.
The timing. It had to be just right, didn't it?
Absolutely critical. He needed specific conditions. A full moon for the airborne drops overnight so they could see. And then, at dawn, he needed a low tide, specifically half tide on the ebb for the beach landings.
Why low tide?
To expose Rommel's beach obstacles, those stakes and metal things he'd planted. At high tide, they'd be hidden underwater, lethal for landing craft. Low tide meant the engineers could see them and hopefully clear paths.
So full moon, low tide at dawn. That really narrowed it down.
It did. In early June 44, the only window was June 5th, 6th, or 7th, and earlier was better for surprise. So Ike initially picked June 5th.
But then, the weather.
The weather, yeah. Just days before, a massive storm blew up in the channel. Really bad conditions. On June 4th, Eisenhower had to make the agonizing call to postpone. Some ships had already sailed. They had to be recalled.
Imagine the tension, the waiting.
Unbelievable pressure. Any delay risked revealing the whole thing. He was constantly checking with the meteorologists. Group Captain Stagg was the chief forecaster. The initial long-range outlook was terrible.
What did postponing mean? Logistically, for morale.
Huge implications. Troops cooped up on ships, schedules thrown off, momentum lost. The waiting must have been torture. Sergeant O'Neill mentions the British troops stuck on their landing craft, anxious, not knowing where they were going.
People turning to prayer, trying to keep busy.
Yeah, church services packed, trying to distract themselves. Fear grows in idle time.
But then, a glimmer of hope.
On the evening of the 4th, Stagg came back with a slightly better forecast. A possible brief window, a temporary lull in the storm, calmer seas predicted for the 5th and into the 6th.
So Eisenhower had to decide,
Yeah.
based on that forecast.
Yes, a massive gamble. But he took it. He gave the order. Okay, let's go. D-Day was set for June 6th, just a 24-hour delay.
Incredible decision. So June 5th, the machine starts rolling again, air attacks.
Widespread bombing raids across northern France, trying to hit railways, bridges, communication lines, anything to slow down German reinforcements when the landing started.
But those bombings, civilian casualties, the documentary mentioned that.
Tragically, yes. Nearly 4,000 civilians, French and German, were killed in the bombing of Lower Normandy in the days leading up to and including D-Day. Churchill was apparently very concerned about the impact on French support.
A terrible cost of war.
It really highlights the brutal calculations involved. At the same time, the French resistance kicked into high gear, sabotaging railways, cutting phone lines, doing their part to help the invasion succeed. And the Allies kept up the deception, running fake naval maneuvers north of Le Havre to keep the Germans looking towards Calais.
And Eisenhower, he went to see the paratroopers before they left, the 101st Airborne.
He did, a very moving moment shown in the documentary. He went to wish them luck, shaking hands, trying to offer encouragement. Knowing full well how dangerous their mission was, they were dropping in behind enemy lines in the dark.
And he wrote that letter, didn't he, just in case it all went wrong?
He did, took full responsibility in advance if the landings failed. Shows the weight he was carrying.
So the paratroopers, painting their faces, getting ready, they knew the risks.
Oh, they knew. They were told to expect maybe 50% casualties. They were carrying radios to mark the drop zones for the gliders coming later. Just incredibly brave young men heading into the unknown.
Then, early morning, June 6th. The bombardment starts.
3:45 a.m., the air bombing begins on the coastal defenses. Then, as dawn breaks, the warships open up. A massive naval barrage aimed at smashing the Atlantic Wall defenses. Omaha Beach was one of the first targets.
Omaha. The American beach. What was their objective there?
Secure the beachhead, link up with Utah Beach further west, and then push inland towards Cherbourg. That was the plan.
But it went wrong. Badly wrong at Omaha.
Horribly wrong. The pre-landing bombing, it mostly missed, either too far inland or too far out at sea. And the naval shelling wasn't as effective either, partly because the tide hid some defenses. So the first waves, the experienced 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, and the less experienced 116th Regiment, they hit a German defense that was basically still intact and waiting for them.
What happened to the landing craft?
Many were dropped too far out in rough seas. The men jumped into deep water, weighed down by gear, and the Germans just opened up with everything they had. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. Robert Capper, the photographer there, called it a turkey shoot.
Just devastating fire.
Devastating. Currents pushed boats off course. Many men drowned before even reaching the beach. The water turned red. It quickly became known as Bloody Omaha.
Did they think about calling it off? Abandoning Omaha?
They seriously considered it. The command back on the ships got reports of chaos, massive casualties, no progress. It looked like a disaster. Hundreds killed for seemingly nothing.
But they didn't pull out.
No. Somehow, through sheer grit, individual bravery, small groups of soldiers finding tiny gaps, blowing holes in obstacles, scaling the bluffs, they started to make agonizingly slow progress. And eventually, more troops started getting ashore, but it was absolute hell.
Meanwhile, the other beaches. Sword, Juneau, Gold, the British and Canadians, Utah for the Americans.
Thankfully, not the same catastrophe as Omaha. The landings on Sword, Juneau, and Gold on the eastern side went relatively better. They faced tough resistance, absolutely, but they got ashore, secured their initial objectives, and started pushing inland towards Caen.
Sergeant Grant's account from Sword Beach sounds intense.
Yeah, the documentary captures that chaos, the noise, the fear, getting off the landing craft under fire. Sergeant O'Neill, the cameraman, was actually wounded filming on Sword. They took casualties, around 600 on Sword, but they secured the beach.
And the Canadians at Juneau?
They faced strong defenses, too. Their objective was Carpiquet Airfield near Caen. There's amazing footage from a tank-mounted camera there. They liberated the first French house, a proud moment, but lost about 300 men. Then they moved towards Caen, celebrating French civilians.
So a mixed picture on the beaches, while Eisenhower is broadcasting to the world.
Yeah, he gave that address on the BBC, projecting confidence, resolve. But behind the scenes, the news from Omaha must have been deeply worrying.
Okay, so the Allies are ashore. What happens next? Montgomery's approach. Caution.
That's how the documentary portrays it somewhat. The British and Canadians did well getting ashore, but Monty perhaps didn't push his armored divisions inland aggressively enough on day one. Caen wasn't taken as planned. Maybe the troops were just relieved to be off the beaches, but that initial momentum wasn't quite there.
And we see footage from Norman Clegg, the cameraman, showing liberated French civilians.
Yeah, incredible scenes of joy and relief. But he also filmed German prisoners, the wounded, showing the cost on both sides. Tragically, Clegg himself was killed just 5 days later, a reminder the danger was far from over.
The failure to take Caen quickly. That allowed the Germans to react.
It did. They rushed reinforcements to Caen, including elite panzer divisions like the 12th SS Hitlerjugend. They counterattacked, dug in, and stopped the British-Canadian advance short of the city and the airfield. This really bogged things down around Caen.
And the Allied bombing of Caen caused problems.
Well, the Germans held positions just outside, so the bombing often hit the city itself, causing civilian casualties and rubble that actually hindered the Allied advance later. German propaganda even tried to use it, saying they were suffering alongside the French civilians.
What about the paratroopers who dropped inland?
They had a rough time initially. Many were scattered far from their drop zones. Linking up with the beach forces was hard. They faced German attacks. Many were captured, especially the Americans suffered high casualties.
But their being scattered caused confusion.
Ironically, yes. The Germans thought a much larger airborne force had landed than actually had, which tied up some of their reserves trying to hunt them down. So, a difficult start, but they did disrupt the German response.
It took time to link up the beachheads.
It did. Isigny, a key town between Omaha and Utah, was heavily defended and bombed. It wasn't taken until June 9th, but its capture finally connected the American beaches, creating one solid front, about 60 miles long.
And then de Gaulle arrived.
Yes, the head of the Free French. A significant moment shown in the documentary. He meets Montgomery, makes it clear France expects a major role in its own liberation, asserting French authority right away.
All this time, supplies are pouring in through those mulberry harbors.
Absolutely vital. They were working, bringing in thousands of vehicles, tons of supplies, endless streams of men every day. Aramash in the British sector and one at Omaha. Essential lifeline.
But then, another storm.
A huge one, mid-June. Apparently the worst storm there in 40 years. It just hammered the coast, wrecked the artificial harbors, smashed the concrete caissons, swept away the floating piers.
Disaster. How long were supplies cut off?
For about 4 critical days, the flow of supplies was drastically reduced. They managed to repair the Aramash harbor eventually, but the one at Omaha was too badly damaged. It set the whole Allied timetable back by maybe 10 days.
Making Cherbourg even more important.
Absolutely critical now. They needed that proper deepwater port intact if possible.
But the Germans in Cherbourg held out.
They did. Even though surrounded, they fought hard. U.S. forces finally broke into the outskirts around June 26th. The German commander, von Schlieben, surrendered that day.
A big moment. Capturing part of the Atlantic Wall.
Hugely significant. Lots of prisoners taken too. A major blow to the Germans.
Hitler wasn't happy. He replaces von Rundstedt.
Yeah, brings in von Klug. But Rommel, by this point, was getting really pessimistic. He could see they were just delaying the inevitable. Eisenhower, meanwhile, was getting frustrated with the slow progress, especially around Caen.
And the Americans were struggling in the Bocage.
That hedgerow country, yeah. Vicious fighting. The hedgerows were like natural fortifications for the Germans. Very high casualties for the Americans trying to advance through that terrain.
So Caen still wasn't taken.
Not fully. Montgomery finally resorts to massive RAF bombing raids to try and break the deadlock. British troops eventually entered the eastern part of Caen around July 13th, but it was ruins. Progress was much slower than hoped.
Churchill visits. Eisenhower leans on Bradley. They need a breakthrough.
Exactly. Bradley comes up with Operation Cobra. The plan: use overwhelming, concentrated air power. Carpet bombing a narrow sector of the German lines near Saint-Lô.
Did it work?
Devastatingly well.
Okay.
On July 25th, waves of bombers just pulverized the German defenses, including General Lair's Panzer Division. It tore a huge hole in the front line.
The breakout.
The Americans poured through the gap, finally clear of the bocage, and started advancing rapidly into Brittany, towards the Seine and Loire rivers.
And the French 2nd Armored Division arrives, under Leclerc.
Yeah, famous Free French general. They joined Patton's Third Army, which is now racing across France.
But the Germans try one more counterattack.
Mortain.
They do. Hitler personally orders it. A desperate gamble to cut off Patton's spearheads, drive back to the coast. But Allied air power just smashes the attack. It fails completely.
And Bradley sees an opportunity.
A huge one. The failed German attack created a bulge, a salient. Bradley realizes they can trap the Germans. He has the Americans swing north, while the British and Canadians push south, encirclement.
The Falaise pocket? Exactly. The German 7th Army is caught, annihilated. Eisenhower saw the battlefield afterwards, described it as one of the worst scenes of destruction he'd ever witnessed. Thousands killed, tens of thousands captured. The German army in Normandy effectively destroyed.
And the road to Paris is open.
Wide open. Patton's tanks are racing towards it. An uprising starts inside Paris. The German commander there realizes it's hopeless, decides to withdraw.
De Gaulle wants the French to liberate their own capital.
He insists on it, meets Eisenhower, persuades him. So, Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division gets the honor. They enter Paris first.
Must have been incredible scenes.
Ecstatic welcome, pure joy and celebration. De Gaulle arrives, asserts the authority of his provisional government immediately. Eisenhower backs him.
But the war wasn't over.
Not by a long shot. Eisenhower, even amidst the celebrations in Paris, his focus was already shifting back to defeating Germany itself. He knew France's stability was vital for post-war Europe, but the main fight was still ahead.
And the documentary ends reflecting on those images, the individual stories.
Yeah, the sheer power of the footage, the personal accounts, from the generals making impossible decisions down to the soldiers facing the fire and the cameramen capturing it all.
So wrapping this up,
Yeah.
what are the big takeaways from this deep dive, looking through the lens of the documentary?
Well, first, just the mind-blowing scale and complexity of it all. Operation Overlord wasn't simple, it was incredibly hard won. Second, the critical importance of those key decisions, the location, the timing, the deception plan. Third, the shocking human cost on all sides. And fourth, maybe the role of innovation, like those mulberry harbors.
Yeah, and I was struck by how tough the German defense was in places like Omaha and Cannon. Even against overwhelming odds, it wasn't a walkover anywhere. And those stories of the cameramen, it really brings the human element home.
Absolutely. It makes you think, doesn't it, about the impact of all this. Not just winning the war, but shaping everything that came after. Post-war Europe, the world order. It was all being forged right there in those decisions on those beaches.
Makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently? What if that weather forecast had been wrong? What if Rommel had got his pantsers on the coast?
Exactly. It forces you to think about leadership under pressure, the importance of planning, but also the role of chance, and just the resilience of people in the face of something so enormous and terrible. What can we really learn from it today? That's maybe the final thought to leave you with.